Welcome, everybody, to today's panel discussion about the Equifax data breach and its legal and policy implications. My name is Ed Felton. I'm the director of the Center for Information Technology Policy here. And on behalf of the Center in Princeton, I want to welcome all of you, including those who are watching online. And I want to welcome and thank our panelists as well. The plan for this afternoon is pretty straightforward. I'll introduce the panelists and give a little bit of quick factual background to set the stage for what we're talking about, what this breach was. Then I will ask each of the panelists in turn to give opening remarks of 5 to 7 minutes. And then we'll have discussion among the panelists. And then finally, we'll open it to questions from the audience and roundtable discussion. So first, let me introduce the panelists. Starting immediately to my left, Kent Anderson is an attorney at the Brock Eichler firm here in New Jersey. He previously served as a Deputy Attorney General of the state of New Jersey in the Office of the State Attorney General. In that capacity, he worked on cases and initiatives related to today's topic. Marshani Chetty is a research scientist in the Department of Computer Science here at Princeton. Her work focuses on designing systems to help users manage different aspects of technology, including security and financial activity. Sanjay Gupta is Executive Vice President and Head of Model Development at PNC Bank. He's worked extensively in the areas of quantitative modeling, credit risk, model validation, and risk governance. And Joel Reidenberg, who will be familiar to regulars here at CITP, is a professor at Fordham Law School, and he's a leading international scholar in internet law, privacy, and cybersecurity. He was CITP's first Microsoft visiting professor of information technology policy back in 2013 and 14, and he's been a visiting research collaborator here since then. On the event website, you'll see longer biographies of the panelists and longer lists of their various honors and positions and awards and so on, and I'd urge you to look at those. So let me give a little bit of background about the Equifax breach. First, Equifax is one of the major consumer credit reporting agencies. That means that they're in the business of aggregating information about consumers' financial and credit activities, and they sell that information to institutions and companies for use in decisions about credit, employment, and so on. Companies in this business are regulated under a law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA, which I'm sure we'll hear about from the panelists. In May through July of this year, of 2017, unknown persons intruded into Equifax's computer systems and exfiltrated personal data about approximately 145 million Americans, as well as a smaller number of people from the UK and elsewhere. Equifax discovered the breach in late July of this year, and they first disclosed it to the public 6 weeks later on September 7th. The intrusion was possible because Equifax failed to patch a vulnerability in a technology component called Apache Struts, which is a web programming format that Equifax used in building their website. The vulnerability had been disclosed publicly back in early 2017 in March, and a patch to fix the vulnerability had been made available back in March of 2017. At that time, Equifax applied the patch to its affected systems, or it thought it did, but for reasons that are not yet clear publicly, Equifax failed to patch at least one system that was affected by the Struts vulnerability. The unpatched system is the one that was exploited by the intruders. Security experts also noted that had Equifax's systems been architected differently, a Struts vulnerability would not have had such severe consequences and would not have put consumer data of this sort at risk. It would have been difficult but not impossible to architect Equifax's systems in a different and more robust way. But for reasons that, again, are not entirely clear publicly as of yet, Equifax did not do that. So the result of all of this has been a flurry of activity, of criticism of the company, and other reactions, which are the beginning of the starting point for today's panel. So with that, let me turn to the panelists and ask each of them to make some opening remarks. I'll start with Kent Anderson.
So first of all, thank you. And thanks to the Center for inviting me. So just to provide a little bit more background about myself, while I was at the Attorney General's office, where I was up until June of this year, I was one of the lead attorneys in the Data Privacy and Data Protection Unit that had primary responsibility for investigating data breaches and enforcing New Jersey's Identity Theft Prevention Act, which is the data breach notification statute in the state. So I thought, as a former regulator, I would give kind of a regulatory background to see kind of current lay of the land of what it looks like out there for Equifax post-breach. So to me, that's split up into two topics. The first topic being what is happening on the ground under existing regulations by the different regulators in our overlapping scheme in the United States of federal and state regulation. And then the second topic in this area is proposals and ideas to change the existing regulatory structure in the country in response to the breach. So in my mind, the existing the response right now under the existing regulatory structure is pretty common for what you see in a big data breach of this sort. Nothing really compares to this that comes to mind for me, but the other massive like retail data breaches like Home Depot and Target all saw a similar type response. This is just ratcheted up in proportion to the number of consumers whose information was breached, and really kind of in proportion to the media scrutiny that's been that's surrounding this breach itself. So you have on the federal level at least two federal agencies that are investigating. That's the FTC, and we know this because they took the rare step of making a public statement and saying that they are investigating. And then the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is also investigating. There's probably a investigation ongoing by the SEC. The reporting on that isn't as clear to me, but given the allegations that have come out about corporate executives potentially trading when the company knew about the breach but before it was disclosed to the public, I would be shocked if there wasn't an open file somewhere at the SEC. So that's what's happening on the federal level. On the state level, again, very typical for a large data breach, you have basically an investigation by every state attorney general that has a data protection initiative in their office. And also typical of this size of a breach, a lot of the states have banded together to form a multi-state investigation. And we know this because they sent out a multi-state letter pretty soon, a couple weeks after the breach, to Equifax, really taking them to task for mostly focusing on their post-incident response and the credit monitoring product that they offer to consumers and the terms and conditions associated with that, particularly the arbitration provision that was included in there. But I imagine there's an active multi-state investigation, and then as what happens in our kind of patchwork scheme, at least one state has already filed a lawsuit on its own, that'd be Massachusetts, and then on the local level you have lawsuits by the city of Chicago and the city of San Francisco that have kind of gone out there, and they filed suits pretty soon after the breach. So that's pretty standard, but like I said, the scrutiny and the intensities of these investigations is kind of just in proportion to the size of the breach and the media scrutiny surrounding it. What I think is a more interesting topic for today is what's going on at the federal legislative level, kind of in that second category I was talking about. So there's obviously been legislative hearings investigating the breach, but really those are geared more towards developing new policies and laws that will alter the existing regulatory structure to hopefully prevent something like this from happening again. And in my mind, there's two main proposals that are out there that have differing goals. The first one is there really is no federal agency that has oversight over credit reporting agencies right now. So the FTC has certain authority to go in post-breach and do an investigation. The CFPB has certain enforcement authority under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but there's nobody that can just go in without a breach and audit a credit reporting agency. And there's been some discussion at the federal level of giving that authority to either the FTC or the CFPB. My money would be on the FTC. The second proposal that's out there is more of a comprehensive regulatory change, and there was a statute proposed a couple of weeks ago by Senate Democrats. It really creates a federal data breach reporting notification statute, so there is no data breach notification statute at the federal level now also creates data security requirements, I think, for any company that has or deals with 10,000 or more consumer records containing sensitive, personally identifiable information, and then it has a hefty civil penalty provision in there so post breach, if you violated either the notification provision or the data security provisions, then you could be liable for, I think it's $16,500 per consumer whose record was potentially affected. So if you do the math for Equifax, I think, I'm not a mathematician, but that's, I think, over $2 trillion in civil penalties there. And there's a third idea that's being bandied about that's not really of a piece as the others, but it's just kind of a wholesale change to how the Social Security number is used to be kind of the key to an individual's financial kingdom, essentially, which I think is an interesting discussion and an important one to have going forward. If my parents came to me and told me that they used the same 9-digit numeric password for every financial account they had for their entire lives, I would be telling them to change that as soon as possible. So it might be time to revisit the Social Security number as the keys to the kingdom.
Great. Thanks, Kent. We turn next to Marshini
Great.
Chetty.
So my name is Marshini. A little bit of background on me. I'm a computer scientist, and I work on human-computer interaction, also in the area of usable security. So mostly what I wanted to talk about was the actual users involved in the system. So the breach was blamed on some poor system admin who failed to basically apply a patch, or that's what it seems like from the articles in the popular media. But what I've been studying for the last 4 years is how users are actually applying patches and how difficult it actually is to know what vulnerabilities are there, how critical they are, whether you actually need them, if the machines that you're managing are affected. So we've just finished a study of about 100 different system administrators managing between 3 to upwards of 2,000 machines. And for these system administrators, it's really hard to know, even if a vulnerability like Apache struts and this vulnerability was disclosed, if that is affecting their systems, if it's really critical. They have like a vulnerability score metric, the CVSS, but it's not necessarily something that all the system administrators that we've spoken to are actually trained to do. So at a ground, on the ground, it's really hard to actually implement these changes. And one thing we're also hearing from the system administrators is that often, depending on the company, there is no company policy on how to apply and manage patches for large machines. So some of the companies like Facebook that we've spoken to have a dedicated team where they have a team for each of their services that manages updates for each of those services. But many of the government system administrators that we spoke to, even within the government across different departments, there's no necessarily standard policy. So I think one of the problems is there's no best practices in terms of what sort of policy a company should have. There's no training standardized across system administrators. And for system administrators, there are very few tools to help them identify which machines they need to patch. Other issues that come up with patching is that, for example, the Apache struts vulnerability that needed to be patched would have taken a lot of effort to do. So they had to download the patch, rebuild all the apps that use this particular web framework, and then wait and test all of this stuff. And what we're finding, not just with system administrators, but even everyone like us, when it comes to a patch, if you've had a bad experience with a patch, you don't necessarily want to apply that patch straight away. So pretty much most of the administrators we're speaking to saying, even if a patch comes out on March 6th or whatever, they're not going to apply it straight away. They're going to monitor forums, blogs, things like Reddit to see, is this patch really something I want to apply? What are other people experiencing? Is this thing buggy? And then they'll decide to actually to roll out that change. So for me, the issue is not just the policy side of it, but if you actually want to get change into the companies and have things like the ability to audit patching and so on, we need better tools to help people find the patches that they need, automate some of these systems. So some automation tools exist. Some of them are called Puppet. There's one called Chef and one called Ansible. I don't know who comes up with these names. But definitely there's a fine line between automating too much and then still giving someone control so that they can actually know what's happened if something has failed. So, for example, if one machine is not patched, they need to be able to easily detect that and then fix that problem. So for me, the question is, how much oversight should there be over the actual patching process and keeping systems secure? Is this the responsibility of the system administrator? Is it the responsibility of the company? How can the policies and regulations from, actually be implemented at the company level? And I think that's an open question.
Great. I will pass it on to Sanjay Gupta.
Yeah, hi. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. I have a very different background and experience. I work for a bank which uses this information. So, as Ed mentioned, the credit scores, the credit bureaus sell their information, and we are one of the largest, buyers. Financial institutions are the largest buyers. So I work for PNC Bank, and my background is I run the quant group, responsible for building models which use this information, and I happen to chance meet Joel. I was having this conversation on this costs of these breaches, which I call the iceberg costs, hidden costs, which are not visible in the policy framework. So I thought this would not be an interesting thought process to bring it to this attention. And I would also like to say before I begin, whatever views I am propounding here are my own views. They do not represent the views of PNC Bank or any of our subsidiaries or affiliates. I want to be completely legally policy clear. I have enough regulators around me. The way I look at this problem is from a different perspective. Does it cost the customer? Does it cost the financial institution at a macro level and the customer at a micro level when such events happen? 145 million customers. To me, that represents like a bulk of US population. So as it was mentioned, that that 9-digit number, which represents the keys to the kingdom, can I trust the information associated with that number as I run them through my models? So imagine a scenario in which any financial institution takes the inputs based on that number, runs it through exotic algorithms or models, or comes up with a credit score which is used in pricing your mortgage. And I have gone through this experience personally very recently. How do you get to ascribe cost to that process if that information coming through because of this breach and the release of information is incorrect, or somebody has fiddled with that information so that your credit history or scores are compromised? Based on what I understand of my conversations with the credit bureaus and my teams who use this information, the breach has not been on your credit files. Like the history has not been breached, so that information is not available. But let's assume in some case even those files were compromised, just as a hypothetical example or a thought experiment. Then the basic lifeblood of what we do for a living, both as consumers and as bankers, we do not know what to trust. If you do not know what to trust, how will I make a good credit decision? How will I create a credit policy? So it leads to two basic policy issues. One on risk measurement, like how will you measure the risk, let us say, of any of the person here in the audience whose information I cannot trust as a banker, and what does it cost from a risk management policy of the bank on how to do this? These are the hidden costs, which are called the iceberg costs. On the other hand, there are visible costs. I'm sure I do not know, and I've done this polling many times when I go and speak at public forums. How many of you have ever logged a credit? How many of you, let's do a poll very simply, how many of you have logged your credit scores? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we have had a breach, 145 million. You should have done it. How many even know that there is a company which charges money? I will not name the company. If you unlock your credit score, which is your information. So there are these transparent costs in the system, and there are these iceberg costs. How do we take that into account? And the last point I want to make is, we are sitting in a top school. We must represent the tip of the society in terms of financial, analytical, or intellectual sophistication. Now you take this to a common person on the street, how would he or she react to this issue? You apply for a mortgage, there is something wrong in your information, and he or the loan officer comes back with a rate of 3.45%. And at that time, you are interested in buying a house. You are not interested in finding the information. Assume you have a $200,000 mortgage, a 0.5% increase is $1,000 cost every year. For 30 years, it's a $30,000 cost. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, that there are enormous costs of such breaches if we do not take that information into account. And lastly, if I have to now take this information into account in my models, which I trust, if we assumed a certain volatility or uncertainty in our estimates, now that uncertainty has to be higher. And ultimately, who pays for that uncertainty? I don't have to answer the question, but everybody knows who pays for that uncertainty. Thank you.
Thanks. Joel Reidenberg.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be back on a panel here and to address some of these issues. I want to come back and talk a little bit about the law and policy angle to the breach. And I think it's a nice segue from what Sanjay was just discussing, because as Ed mentioned at the beginning, the Fair Credit Reporting Act is the statute governing credit reporting agencies. It was enacted primarily to protect the integrity of the credit reporting system. And these kind of breaches are really challenging the integrity of the system from the modeling perspective, from the consumer trust perspective. It's quite disturbing. 60%, if you actually do the math, it turns out to be 60% of the adult population of the United States had their financial information compromised in this one single hack. The company itself suffered some pretty serious losses as well. In the first week, their stock dropped 37%, and it's still down 22% compared to what it was immediately before the breach. So we see a market impact on company valuation. We see an impact on the consumers. And our legal question is really, how do we incentivize better security and resilience for organizations that are holding this kind of consumer financial information? The immediate thing that we think of, you all, the six of you who froze your credit scores, you do that because you're worried about identity theft. It will be very difficult to attribute any specific instance of identity theft to this particular breach. We may, at a macro level, be able to do it. In your modeling, you'll probably see a spike at some time lag from the exfiltration. There's going to be a spike in identity thefts taking place, credit application fraud. But to be able to link any specific one to this breach is going to be very hard. So we have to think about it as a more systemic problem, right? How do we incentivize better security? How do we deal with resilience? In the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there is no specific data security obligation. It's kind of surprising. Maybe not so if you think back when it was enacted, it wasn't as big an issue. There is a provision in the statute that requires consumer reporting agencies to maintain reasonable procedures designed to avoid violations of 1681C, which turns out in 1681B. Basically, the credit reporting agencies can only disclose the consumer information for a defined set of permissible purposes. Giving it to hackers is not one of those legitimate purposes. So if they don't have reasonable procedures to avoid improper disclosure, they're in violation of the statute. The hackers, by the way, have violated the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's a violation of the statute to wrongfully obtain a consumer report. But what will happen with that? Individuals, there are I think 240 plus class action suits that have been filed against Equifax, as well as the ones that Kent mentioned. So we're going to see litigation over whether or not their security approach was reasonable, right? They'll, I'm sure, going to defend about having to wait, test, see, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. That's going to be hashed out, at least in some of the litigation. The other area where we see the law kind of stepping in, it's new, it's the FTC has elaborated a doctrine that weak security can be treated as an unfair business practice. And they brought a very well-known case against Wyndham Hotels on this that established their authority to say that. I think we're going to begin to see that cropping up a little bit more. We've already seen it in a different way in court cases involving other major breaches, particularly Home Depot, Target. Negligence claims were brought against the companies. And the argument was that they had a duty of care that included strong security when they were holding this sensitive financial information. And they breached that duty. Their failure to lock down the systems was a negligent act. So it comes back, is it negligence to patch some of the system but not another piece of the system? These doctrines are beginning to evolve. We really haven't seen most of the negligence, I think all the negligence cases wound up with settlements, not with actual court decisions giving us a firm guidance on what constitutes that duty. So if we think, on this legal side, we really have to begin moving forward, looking to see what kind of data security obligations do we want to enshrine as a legal obligation, and what will be the sanctions for the breach. In the Equifax case, if they lose on a Fair Credit Reporting Act claim, statutory damages will bankrupt the company because it's was it $1,500 per violation. There are 145 million violations. Each loss is a violation. Each exfiltration is a violation. So the potential damages are quite staggering. If we think about the resilience, how do we build resilience into the system? Well, we have to think about what's the mitigation. What kind of remediation might we want to see? We've seen it. We've all gotten offers for credit monitoring. That's sort of wonderful, but does that really help us? In a settlement in the Home Depot case, the consumers are getting $15 per hour for the time they spent dealing with the breach. So if they had to look at their credit reports, it takes time to get your credit report, look at it, call the credit grantors, get your fraud alert placed. They can get 15 hours, I think up to a maximum of 5 hours. That was built, it was a notion that there's some harm there. So I think as we think about it, we have to think about what are the harms that we want to compensate people for. We can't attribute a particular credit fraud to a specific breach, but we sure know that a breach like the Equifax is going to cost us time. And how do we begin to build that into our ecosystem, really? I think I'll end it there.
Great. That's a great place to stop, or a great place to move on to discussion among the panelists. And I want to throw out a few things for discussion. Let me start by talking about the problem of identity theft, as it's sometimes called, which several of you mentioned. So identity theft, the name is a bit of a misnomer. What is really going on is, in identity theft, is impersonation. It's a person using, pretending to be or impersonating a particular individual and getting credit or doing a financial transaction in that person's name. So this is impersonation fraud. And of course, it has costs throughout the system. The fraud directly takes money from somebody. And it also messes up risk scoring models and so on, as Sanjay talked about. And so the question is, what could we do about this kind of, in order to reduce this kind of risk? People often point the finger at that 9-digit number, the Social Security number. And indeed, when we teach security, even to freshmen, we teach that it's a bad idea to use the same information to identify someone and also as a secret password. But in practice, in the consumer credit system, we use the Social Security number both as an identifier to say who that person is and to link their different records across different transactions and to build these unified models and so on, and as a secret password. And yet it demonstrably fails in a case where the Social Security number becomes widely known, either because the consumer uses it in a lot of places or because it's stolen. So how could we think about what we could do in order to get into a better situation where companies don't feel like they have to rely on something like the Social Security number or mother's maiden name or birthday or some other knowable information about an individual in order to identify them?
So
And-
one thing I would say, like if you look at the evolving, and I have studied to some degree the new system they have launched in India, the biometric Aadhaar card, where they are trying to create a biometric social security number. Now, there have been debates on both sides of the aisle whether that information can be stolen or not. But a priori, it seems difficult to steal somebody's eye color or fingerprint and trying to impersonate over the phone. But this has a cost. Like if you look at transaction approval systems or the point of sale mechanisms, they are not equipped to handle a thumbprint or a scanner or an iris scan and authenticate the transaction. That's one kind of a cost which somebody will have to incur to retool the entire financial system. I think the second question is the aggregation of information. We use this as a mechanism, social security number as a primary key to link various databases. And that's a question, we have a lot of computer scientists here, and I'm not the computer scientist, but we are seeing a lot of machine learning models which are being trained and kind of adapt and learn from the different transactions and trying to provide a credit profile, looking up information from Facebook, from Twitter feeds, and trying to get a lock on whether this is the individual which has walked in, and like two-factor authentication using both a identifier and a device, like a phone or a tablet or an email to confirm the identity. But again, that means tooling. US has been very slow to adopt even the chip and pin technology. So how will we make sure that these basic innovations are then propagated through the commercial transaction mechanisms? I think that's something which we'll have to consider.
Yeah, let me jump in and pick up on the comment about machine learning. I wonder if that's not going to be a future both fruitful and necessary way to address the problem. Because when you think of identity theft or impersonation, you're absolutely right, it's impersonation, it's not really theft. Financial institutions are the ones who today legally hold the bag. Right, the consumer is not held responsible for the fraudulent transaction. There are statutory rights that impose that liability on the banks or the financial institutions. There are also regulations known as the red flags rule that require financial institutions to be monitoring their systems to try to flag suspicious transactions, to try to prevent it. So if you look at the banks, or particularly the credit card issuers, they've done, I think, a pretty effective job in being able to nip in the bud and stop a fraudulent credit card application or a fraudulent transaction on someone's credit card. I had I'll give an interesting personal anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, I get a call from a bank asking me to verify charges on my Alaska Airlines Visa card. I don't have an Alaska Airlines Visa card. And it was a bank I did business with, so I first assumed it was potentially a phishing call. So I said, thank you for telling me about this, I'm going to call you back. And I call back a number that I know, in fact, is the bank. Long of the short, a wrongdoer got access, they got my social security number somehow. It may have been Equifax, it may not, but just as a little aside, it costs $1 on the black market to buy a social security number. So it's pretty cheap to get one. They tried to open up 2 credit cards. One was this Alaska Airlines card, another was a Carlton Hotel co-branded card from some bank in North Dakota. Both banks recognized it as a suspicious card opening and blocked it. The wrongdoer was very clever. He also opened up a online account with UPS with my address to try to reroute the physical card that was being sent to my home. Again, all these things, you could catch these things, but the bank had flagged, he or she tried to charge on the Alaska card. They flagged it immediately. The North Dakota bank flagged it as a potentially suspicious account, and they didn't open the account. Right? So they've developed mechanisms that are pretty good, but it's only in that specific space where I think they're on the hook. The consumer reporting agencies aren't on the hook in the same way. So they don't have the incentive. TransUnion, as it turns out, the wrongdoer opened up an online access to my TransUnion account. And it was very interesting to see what it took for me to be able to convince TransUnion that I was really the consumer and not the wrongdoer. It was actually easier than it should have been. But nevertheless, I was able to reacquire my own account. But again, the point is, if you develop machine learning systems that are relying on other bits of data other than that 1 9-digit number, then the fact that so many organizations have used it will become less and less relevant. And I think that's something we're going to have to move toward and figure out how we incentivize that.
I was just going to say that I think it's an open question still for security researchers. It's a very hard thing to solve, to help identify someone and believe that they are who they say they are. And that's something that we're still working on. Something else that is interesting is that even though this is a universal identifier, the social security number, many systems today are also trying to move towards a universal login. That's why in lots of systems you'll see things like login with Facebook or login with Google. So that's also opening up people to, more breaches, because their data could be, if one thing is hacked, then you'll be hacked in many other ways. So I think, and I don't think any system is perfect. Having studied users for many, many years, anything, as you just proved with your personal anecdote, is subject to social engineering attacks, right? Where someone can phone and impersonate you. And again, it's very hard to prove that you are not, in fact, Joel, right?
And it could be worse with biometrics.
Exactly. And in South Africa, if we had biometrics, I can guarantee you that, yes, you would actually be able to probably take someone's arm or there are, cases where people would go to extreme lengths to try and, get that access to your information. But no, you should still visit. It's a very good country. So, but that's what went through my head. I was like, well, actually. So, I think it's a very challenging problem, and I don't think it's as simple as, okay, we don't use the social security number to identify people, we use something else, because that's just replacing the problem with something else. I think what we need are better ways to prevent social engineering attacks and better ways to do what you're saying, which is monitor activity and then in an aggregate be able to tell that based on this person's history, it is unlikely, or there's a small chance that this is not a transaction that this person has done. And I also have experienced this many times because I travel to South Africa regularly, and so often, the bank will call to say, hey, is this you shopping at Woolworths in South Africa? And it's luckily most of the time me, although sometimes there have been cases where, again, I've been called and someone's bought some tickets in Colorado, etc. So I don't think it's a simple fix. I don't think it's just let's get rid of Social Security as the identifier. And I think everything it's sort of imperfect, and thinking about these systems as things we can do to report suspicious activity or help alert or notify people when something is amiss, whether it's the information you've provided may not be authentic, or you may be at risk for someone impersonating you. That's probably the easier thing to solve in the short term, at least.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. You're exactly right. No system is perfect, and to a certain extent, what you would be doing is taking the current keys to the system and creating keys to the kingdom, and then creating new keys to the kingdom, or putting additional locks on the vault and hiding those keys in different areas. But there's still going to be people out there who are going to be trying to get in, right? And so, the question becomes how best to address that, and where best to, or how to incentivize companies or the government to create new systems that can address the issue. But you're exactly right. I mean, the solution has to be a dynamic solution, one that can evolve with technology. But but the answer is certainly not a 9-digit numeric code anymore. But it is a complicated issue, one that that the smartest people in the country should be working on. Professor Reidenberg's point about how the banks are really good at catching fraud. I mean, just another personal anecdote here. They're so good that a month ago or so, I was buying a iPad Pro at an Apple store, and they prevented me from going through with the transaction because they wanted me to verify by sending a text message to my cell phone that it was in fact me, because I guess there's a lot of fraudulent purchases at Apple stores. So, they do a really good job at that, and that's because they have a very strong incentive to do so. So it's about where you place the incentives, what the incentives are. Going back to my opening remarks about two of the kind of regulatory changes that are being discussed. I mean, the first one, which is just an increase in oversight, is more of a collaborative approach where, the FTC or whatever federal agency gets that authority would be working with credit reporting agencies to, develop their data security in a way to prevent future data breaches, right? And then the other option is really the hammer on the back end. If you do suffer a breach, you're going to be subject to crippling fines, and not only is it going to be the FTC and potentially the Department of Justice or the Attorney General bringing actions against you, but under the current legislation that's been proposed, it's going to be every state Attorney General will also have enforcement authority. So you're going to have a bunch of people coming to you with the ability to assess fines on you under the same statute. So it really creates a strong incentive to comply with the law and to really take matters into your own hands. Now, there can be a policy discussion about, is that the best place to place the burden on the private sector, but those are kind of the two options being discussed right now.
Great. Let's go in that direction. Let's talk about possible legal changes that might address some of these issues. When we talked about this identity theft or impersonation fraud, right, we talked about different ways that banks and other institutions might use machine learning to reduce the amount of fraud. But of course, that's a cost that falls on the banks or the institutions to implement that. And there's some cost that falls on consumers and on other businesses when legitimate transactions are sometimes blocked by mistake, as will inevitably happen with any machine learning system. So there are costs, and those costs are not borne by the entities like the credit reporting bureaus that are protecting the data. And I think many people have argued, including I think several of the panelists today, that the fact that the costs of this kind of fraud are externalized by the credit reporting agencies onto others means that their incentives might not be aligned. And that leads to the calls for the kinds of policy interventions that Kent described and others. So let's talk about now for a bit about what might be done to change law or change policy to try to align the incentives better or to try to reduce the harm, all the harms that we've heard about. How do people feel about these two approaches that Kent mentioned? First, of empowering some agency like the FTC to engage more proactively in something like security audits of credit reporting agencies or other data brokers. Or second, to impose stronger statutory requirements and penalties on companies, such as a federal data breach notification requirement, data security requirements, or potentially financial penalties. That's at least part of the option of choices that are on the table. What do you all think we should actually do?
So I guess I'll jump right in. I mean, as a former regulator, I love giving additional regulatory authority and civil penalty authority to regulatory agencies. And I'm sure my friends over at the Attorney General's office would love that as well. I think a combination of both makes sense. I mean, I think you want, especially in this space where the existing model is one that focuses on, for data breaches, but focuses on transparency and disclosure by the private sector. If you create a system that really stands in between the private sector and the public sector and reduces the communication between those two entities. I don't think anybody wins there. So a reform that includes some oversight and a collaborative approach that also has real teeth on the back end. I mean, it is a really tricky issue to kind of thread the needle there. But I don't think that a private sector company who is looking at the cost to implement a full-blown security audit, then revamp their entire system. This is a very expensive cost up front, and then also a very expensive cost going forward as far as auditing that system and maintaining it. So if they look at the dollars and cents of it, and they go speak with a lawyer like me, and they say, well, what worst case scenario? Let's say I have the end of the world scenario where all of my records are breached. What's my liability on the back end? If they compare those two numbers and the one's higher than the other, they're probably going to go with the cheaper option. We've seen that time and time and again. So the incentive really needs to be there for the companies to comply.
I would agree, just based on, again, the study that we recently are wrapping up. It seems like, many of the people we were speaking to in the ground in these private sector companies are saying things like, often I had to convince, the upper levels in management that this security was even an issue by taking them, screenshots of like vulnerabilities and saying, look, this is what we have and this is what we have to actually patch. So it seems like incentivizing better security practices as well as providing guidelines as to what those should be, and creating systems that would enable more transparency and this kind of auditing would be a good approach in my opinion. I think the problem right now is there is no incentive, and so it's only when a breach happens that people have to actually do something about it. The other thing is it's also not clear what to do after the breach. So Equifax set up this Equifax Security 2017 site, which looked like a phishing site and didn't really work, and now still doesn't really work. So, and also that had vulnerabilities. So, I think aside from incentivizing the system, you have to create some sort of training, some sort of best practices so people actually know what they're supposed to do instead of just penalizing them for what they didn't do. They need to kind of know what they should be doing. And so I think coupled with that, you need guidelines, training, etc., for, what is the best security system you could have.
Just to piggyback on that, and that's a really difficult problem for regulators. So regulators are much more adept at saying, well, you shouldn't have done that, right, than saying you should be doing this. And that is kind of how the regulatory structure has been set up. And, the expertise may or may not be there at some of these agencies to give that sort of advice, but it is a really important problem to deal with and a really tricky problem because, just the way it's been set up and the way it's set up now is for the FTC or state attorneys general to come in after the fact and say, well, you should have known better. That seems like it was you should have patched Apache struts, right? So that's basic. So it's not something that regulatory agencies are great at this point, but it's something that I agree they should become better at, and that really kind of plays into having the public and private sector work together towards kind of a shared mission of privacy.
So the way I look at this problem is slightly different. I'm not a regulator and I get regulated all the time. The implications of such an act of breach or loss of data has to be commensurate with the value of information. I think we are not being able to quantify the value of that information which is lost or breached and how it propagates through the system. We talked about something visible costs and the iceberg costs, but those may or may not be. We talked about why are banks good at it, because the costs are internalized to the bank. So we have to be very careful in making sure that A, the transaction is not fraudulent, B, we do not have any false positives like your case of an iPad, and because that irritates the customers, and the more false positives you will have, guys, we don't really, you stop us from the legitimate transactions, and that may impact your customer service scores rather than, and that has a cost. So again, there are certain external costs why banks are good at it and certain internal costs why banks are good at it. Does the credit reporting agencies have those external or internal costs? How do you make sure that those are there? You will have to force as the customers of this data that the credit reporting agencies take this into account. Customers of this data mean at a micro level, at a consumer level, how much educated or activist we become as consumers whose information they are selling, and B, as buyers from financial institutions, credit card issuers, large transaction processors like Visa or MasterCard, are they forcing their suppliers of information to provide? Because in my experience of working in the private sector, if the customers want something, if the customers make sure or mandate, then the companies have an incentive to perform. Sometimes that is even more relevant than a pure regulatory incentive. Why would an Apple or somebody create a better product? Because the customers want that. So if we as a financial services industry want them to provide better security or better mechanism for linking customer information, they will create it. Similarly, if consumers say, look guys, we are not willing to share this information, or we will have our own qualms about it, then they will be forced. So I think that's one is top-down regulatory approach. The other is from the bottom up, from a consumer's perspective. That will definitely have an impact on both the security of the data as well as the protections these credit reporting agencies have on that data set.
So this is great going last after all of these comments, because I think I disagree with a number of them.
Great.
I'm going to pick up first on Sanjay's about sort of the bottom up. I mean, consumers, maybe sophisticated businesses are in a position to affect the way their counterparties act, but consumers are not. I mean, I think it's completely unrealistic to anticipate that a consumer would be able to either get information or know anything about the security practices of the large organizations with which they do business. If I call my credit card issuer and I ask them, what kind of security do you have on your system? They're going to laugh at me. I'm going to get nothing. So I can't walk with my feet because I have no mechanism to put that sort of pressure on. So I think in that sense, it has to be something more on the top-down side. I'm not very optimistic for the utility of relying on the FTC, no offense, Ed, for these kinds of activities, because when you look at the history of the FTC, its interest and involvement, it does a couple of cases. Right? The number of cases that they bring are very small. They make lots of pronouncements. Some of the big players pay attention to them, but lots of the small, medium-sized businesses, they probably wouldn't even know what FTC stood for. Right? They're totally oblivious to what the FTC is doing. The FTC's actions are also dependent on what the majority of the 5 members want to pursue. We've had a good run for the last 15 or 20 years of interest by the FTC in privacy issues. We now are seeing a total remake of the composition of the FTC, where the new appointees are antitrust lawyers with zero background in data security or privacy. So it's an open question whether the FTC going forward is going to have any interest in pursuing these issues. So I think to hang our hat on that, to me at least, is very worrisome. What I would rather see is that we be much clearer on creating statutory data security obligations. And I don't think, we're certainly not in a position, and as Kent was saying, you can't really say, it's easy to say after the fact that was a mistake. If you're prophylactically creating a data security obligation, it's going to have to be phrased as something like reasonable security measures. I mean, there are examples of this. We see this already in the, well, not exactly. I was going to say in the securities field. There are various regulations that require financial institutions to have policies and procedures to safeguard the information that they have. And generally there's a reasonableness standard for it. So it seems to me that it would be a fruitful approach to say, let's create legal obligations for reasonable security measures as a function of the kinds of data that organizations are storing. And then the remedies for it, I'm a big believer in private rights of action, even though they're not in favor at the moment. But private rights of action where class action suits are part of the deal. And we have a lot of griping about the way class action suits play out in the US. There are a lot of arguments that they're sort of shakedown operations. But I think at least in the privacy and data security area, the class action suits have probably done far more in moving the needle in the way business practices have evolved than actions of many of the regulators. Another area, and this picks up a little bit on what was said before, the SEC is sort of groping for a way to deal with cybersecurity. They're not really sure what to do. They have new guidance where companies, publicly traded companies, have to disclose in their annual reports their cyber risks, what they're doing. It's pretty tepid. It seems to me that information, and we see this so clearly in Equifax breach, information is the equivalent of money for what was the industrial age. So in the industrial age, we had no trouble coming up with gap accounting, right? And every publicly traded company has to have an external auditor come in and issue a certified audit attesting to where the money is. Right? It seems to me we need to have the equivalent for the information age, which the SEC could do by requiring publicly traded companies to produce as part of their annual reports an information security audit report. In other words, have an external organization come in, audit them according to security standards. Are they fulfilling a duty of care? Are they acting negligent? Do they have procedures in place? Is the level of security something that's reasonable in light of what the organization does? And then issue an audit report just like we see on the financial side. I think if you had that, it would go a long way toward incentivizing the kinds of practices that at least will be protective. It won't solve the problem of what happens when the breach occurs, because there will be a breach. But at least we've minimized those instances through better data hygiene and data security practices.
I feel like I have to say something with respect to the FTC since Joel called me out as a former agency official. And I'll just say this, that if you're going to assign a greater responsibility in this area to the FTC or really any other government agency, and whether that is involvement in proactive auditing or investigation, or whether it's the enforcement of some sort of reasonable security measures requirement. You have to make sure as well that that agency has the technical expertise and the staff to actually put that into practice, which the FTC currently does not. If you were to expand their responsibilities in this way, it would have to come with a directive from Congress to hire more staff as well as the funding to support that. And it would be a process for the agency to build up that capability. And I think any assignment of responsibility to a government agency is going to have to come with both the directive to hire the staff as well as the money. And one would hope that bills that take those steps include those sorts of provisions. With that, let me open the floor to the audience, and we'll take questions from you. Joanna.
This has been really interesting, and it's really outside my area, but not entirely. I was in the financial industry briefly, and I certainly recognize some of the dynamics you guys are talking about. I'm really worried about this. One of the things you said, which makes a lot of sense, is having the incentives are going to cost more, but that also sounds like a bit of an arms race. And you could imagine that, so you drive up the costs of doing it badly, you drive up the costs of doing well, keep going up. Does it get to the point where nobody wants to do this anymore? And as I just said, and then the government can't do it for itself. I mean, I'm worried that you're sort of describing something that could be, explosive. It could be where it's not worth anybody's business to provide this kind of infrastructure.
So I think that Ideally, you would try to design a regulatory scheme that would have significant penalties, whether through regulatory action or private rights of action, which I'm also a fan of, but which would incentivize the companies to implement the security, because right now it's cheaper to do that than face the liability on the back end, and then their incentive is to develop and innovate to lower the cost of the security, because it becomes less of a drag on their bottom line going forward.
What is it currently on relative to the cost of security relative to their margins? I mean, I just don't even have a picture on this. What is it currently?
I think it depends on the company size and how many servers they have, how much data they have. I mean, I don't think it's something that's standard for every single company.
I would say we are not even measuring it in the way you are describing, that if there's a data breach, or let us say we have 60 million customers, we collect X attributes of those customers, what is the cost of processing that? What I'm seeing increasingly in the banks particularly, there are offices called chief data officers who are now responsible for collecting, maintaining, making sure that the data is easily available through the organization, as well as protected in case of certain things. But again, still, those responsibilities are clearly being defined, and they are not being measured in a very proactive manner.
If they're not being measured, then that indicates it's small enough on the margins, it's not a big cost at this point, right? Or there's nobody that's kind of insolvent because of this kind of thing.
Again, this becomes very difficult to attribute. We have, let us say, application fraud costs, we have debit card fraud, we get credit card fraud, and as the liability is on a financial institution, so we know what the costs are, and they are not insignificant. So we take, and on the question of arms race, I would think it slightly differently. It's like the anti-lock brakes. I would not look at it as an arms race. Like, the best anti-lock brakes are used for protecting the cars, whether Benz creates that anti-lock brakes and makes it available, or somebody else, like a supplier to the automotive industry, creates that and makes it available to all the auto manufacturers. These days, people are trying to create those systems, either models or policies or information security tools, which they can then sell to the banks, and that becomes a competitive advantage, simply because then the cost of fraud goes down. So it's in our interest as bankers to invest in better models, better tools, and reduce our costs.
I'd like each of you to pull out your crystal balls. What do you think at the end of the day, and I don't know when the end of the day really is, what is going to happen to Equifax?
What is it?
Because corporations are, when you get right down to it, people, what's going to happen to the people that were responsible, either at the top of Equifax or your poor little system administrator? What's going to happen to the people?
So I guess I'll start. There will be significant costs to the company. Well, first of all, to answer your last question first, the CEO that was in charge at the time, he's already out. So he's
Will he end up in jail?
No.
For how long?
No, I don't think
Unlikely.
there's really any law that he violated, or I don't see what the charge would be. As far as the cost to the company, I think Target and Home Depot put their costs at responding to their massive data breaches at between $150 and $200 million. And that's all including responses to regulatory investigations, class action lawsuits, the settlements of all those actions, their attorney's fees, which I think are tens of millions of dollars. Both those cases involved, I think, between 40 and 50 million records. Those involve credit card information, payment card information, but I think you can kind of extrapolate that out to get a rough ballpark of what you can see the financial hit being for Equifax, and add on top of that the fact that their business model is trading in this information. They're definitely going to take a serious reputational hit because of that, which I think is an additional cost that you didn't see built into the estimates from Home Depot and Target.
Home Depot and Target, on their stock prices, it took time, but their stock prices recovered. Thus far, we're a couple of months in, and Equifax is down, is down over 20%. So they've taken a market hit from that. The CEO still may have some problems because there are questions about the stock sales prior to the release. That's a really good question. I think at the end of the day, it's going to cost Equifax. Whether it ends up in closing the company down, I doubt it. I think it more likely Equifax is going to settle the different lawsuits. How much they're going to have to pay out will remain to be seen. In the long term, they're going to have a really hard time rebuilding relationships with their network constituencies. So their constituencies are the credit grantors who report information to Equifax, the purchasers like PNC Bank who buy data from Equifax. The grantors have to be willing to trust that if they give data to Equifax, it's going to stay with Equifax. And the buyers of Equifax data have to be willing to trust that the data isn't compromised. So I think they're going to see a reduction of business on both ends of that spectrum as a result of this particular breach. Whether it's enough to put them out of business or not, hard to say right now.
Yeah, and if they're resilient, obviously they have to improve their security.
So just to follow up on that question, before we go to the next one, from a theoretical standpoint, one of the things you want from a liability regime is that it imposes on a company like this a cost that is about the same as the harm that is done by the breach. Because if that's the case, if that has happened to them and if other people see this happening, then the incentive level will be about right. So do we think that is the case? Do we think that the loss to Equifax due to this is commensurate with the harm that this has caused when you measure harm across the entire economy? Or because if so, then maybe we don't need new regulation.
I think it's hard to assess that. I mean, it seems like the harm that can potentially be done would far outweigh any costs that could be imposed on Equifax.
I mean, just a wild guess, if any panelists want to breach that, is it clear that the cost to Equifax in the end of the day will be more or less or similar to the total harm? Or
I'm going to bet it's less. And the reason I would bet it's less is I'll go back to the original origins of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It was set up because the credit reporting industry was in such chaos at the time that it hindered the credit markets in the United States. And the Credit Reporting Act essentially gave integrity to that marketplace. Equifax is challenging that very integrity. So the systemic harm by a breach of this magnitude by there are 3 companies out there that do this business. A breach of this magnitude by one of the 3 major players is posing a systemic problem for the credit markets that's very hard, I think, to quantify. And likewise, for the 145 million Americans, and not to mention the Brits that got caught up in it, the downtime that the individuals are going to suffer to deal with issues associated with this breach, we tend not to monetize that in the United States. So we don't put a price tag on that, even though it's a true cost. That's not going to get it's unlikely that that's really going to get factored in, unless Equifax is put out of business. And I think that if we think about kind of your question, maybe it takes putting an Equifax out of business to wake up the country to the severity and significance of this problem.
Jeremy.
I had a follow-up on that
Thanks.
question. So it's when you were saying that the loan grantors, the credit grantors would take issue that they're reporting information to Equifax, and that information has been compromised. I look at Equifax, and if Equifax is McDonald's, I would see us not as the diners, but as the cattle. And so in that context, these credit grantors are giving information that helps them grant us credit or not. Does it really make a difference to them? Is this breach really a problem for them? There's the fact that the information out there might be less precise, so they might be less willing to give to subprime borrowers. But what is their cost? Like, from a business standpoint, Equifax hasn't really disserved its customers, which are the businesses. Their data is in breach. Their data hasn't been collected. So do you really think that the credit grantors have that much animosity for Equifax, besides the fact the PR nightmare?
Well, one, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the credit grantors have obligations as furnishers of information to Equifax that they're going to be sensitive to, and it relates to the accuracy of the data that winds up in Equifax's files. So if the concern is that Equifax's systems are insecure, if the data associated with, say, Bank of Princeton winds up incorrect, Bank of Princeton has a problem under the Fair Credit Reporting
They
Act.
have to pay fines.
Um,
Bank has to pay fines if the information is incorrect. So let
Even
me
if it's not their fault.
Even if it's not their fault. Let me answer this question slightly differently. It is human. We have 3 credit agencies primarily, and if you go to a credit policy, this is a policy discussion. So let's look at a credit policy. So if you apply for a loan, we want the look at all the 3 credit scores coming from all the 3 bureaus. Now we will say, why do we need 3? We can do with 2. And if we have to do with 2, who would you go to? You would not go to somebody who's tainted, or it will be difficult for somebody to justify. So ultimately there is a committee making a decision, and you are, let us say, proposing a case for Equifax. It will be very difficult for you to win that argument in that committee.
There was an Experian breach 2 years ago, so they've all had some sort of breaches, and it's not going to be long before TransUnion is breached. So from the point of view of the banks, they're all tainted, and yet they still give them information that allows them to say, you shouldn't have credit, you should have 24 APR, and you should have 9. So from your point of view, does it really make a difference, these breaches?
But these
in the way you're
definitely,
consuming this data?
this definitely impacts in the short-term decisions. If we have to, let us say, make a decision, we will keep this in mind. It's like when we look at companies who support us and they lose our data, will we ever go back to that company? It will be a hard sell. Some of, those forget these breaches, but you see breaches in other places where outsourcing providers, offshore vendors, all of that go through that breaches. I consider that breach in the same vein, that we had customer information and somebody misused that customer information. I would rather avoid that firm. It's an easier sell to avoid than go back and justify. Now, the other argument which, by the way, somebody made to me was, now we should definitely go to Equifax because they would have the best tools. So,
Arch.
All right, a couple things I see here. One is just the scale of what is possible today with information technology, where you can steal everything all at once. I mean, nobody cracked my password to get into that. They got into their load. To use a bank analogy, it's like you put your gold bars in the lobby, and you had security coming in, but you don't put them there. So somehow, I don't know what the technical solutions are, but it's very difficult to harden things, as we know, so forth. But maybe you have to, put the gold in a very heavily armored vault, and the gold being all this data. The second thing is there's another way. There's a company here in Princeton that has a way of monitoring intrusions very quickly, within hours. That's not a hardening as such, but it's also, it's a little bit after the fact, but many intrusions take months or years to mature once the initial breaches are made. So I don't know if Equifax used that. That would be, Nick's son out here that does that.
Just for reference, the Equifax breach did continue for a period of at least 2 months. So it was not detected immediately.
There was a breach I know that Nick's son dealt with. There was an intruder in Germany, hacker if you will, who started in, and within a couple of hours, the German authorities knew about it, and before the morning was over, the guy was in prison. So it wasn't instantaneous, and it wasn't completely hardening the system itself, but that was very quickly dealt with. The Sony breach took over 2 years. If they had had that system, it wouldn't have continued very long at all.
It just seems like part of the solution is some intrusion detection system, better patching practices. But then I think, like Joel was saying, I think it's not just enough to have penalties, but we have to have some way of auditing companies to actually make sure that they are doing something, because right now the incentives are not there.
And depending on how sophisticated the intruder is in a particular case, these sorts of detection systems may or may not detect a particular intrusion.
Right.
There's a constant arms race between intruders and the defensive technologies that's going on.
Yeah, I don't think we know whether or not Equifax had intrusion detection. I don't think that's been revealed yet. I could be mistaken about that, but I haven't seen anything reported on it. But from my perspective as a former regulator, a company with the data like Equifax, of Equifax's size, if they didn't have a sophisticated intrusion detection system, I would say that's not reasonable. Right, and that's a violation of consumer protection statutes across the country. From my discussions with technologists, I'm not a technologist, and with CISOs at big publicly traded companies and that sort of thing, I mean, the focus is, obviously on preventing people from getting into your system, but it's turning more and more towards having transparency across your system to know when an intrusion does occur and then to stop the intrusion, because it's just not realistic to patch every vulnerability. So the focus has been shifting more and more to really being able to monitor and detect what's going on across your systems, which I think that's probably the future.
And that's also still a very big open question. So there's still not very good systems for monitoring multiple machines at scale that can notify you about these kinds of intrusions or things that have to be patched, etc. So many of us are working on those research problems, like how do you actually make these networking issues more transparent to the end users who actually have to implement these policies.
There seems to be no silver bullet, so the best companies are assembling a variety of different approaches which they use together. Yes.
Forgive my ignorance, but if the financial history for each person wasn't stolen, what is it that was stolen that's so valuable that's not public knowledge already? Your name and your social security number that you say is, your address, your phone number, those kinds of data are available without stealing.
For some users, it was driver's license information about driver's license numbers, perhaps the photo on the driver's license. That was not for all users. Equifax has disclosed that at least some of the users had their driver's license images or information stolen.
And some users had credit card numbers exfiltrated as well, and we still don't know. I mean, right now that's what's been made public. It may turn out in 6 months' time that we learn the intrusion was deeper and in fact credit history information was accessed. We don't, until whatever forensic investigation is actually concluded and reported as concluded, I would wait and see what we find. I mean, if you look at the history of so many of these large breaches, the initial report is it's pretty small, it's not that significant. And then as time goes by, it miraculously gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more intrusive. So until people with subpoena power get a chance to see what happened at Equifax, we won't really know the extent.
So three of the panelists, I think, brought up the idea of some form of auditing as a possible solution. I'm very curious to know what you think of the form of auditing. In particular, what triggered was the similarity with DigiNotar, which was a Dutch SSL certificate company that a few years ago was breached and eventually went bankrupt. And they were actually audited because they had to be audited to get the EV certificate by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they passed. There was actually this reasonable security also in it, and they were regularly audited, but actually the forensics later on showed that they had really horrible security practices. So then the question is, of course, what do you put in the audit? What are the rules that, and I don't think as security experts we know even, like, what is that guideline of that this is what you should use?
Yeah, I think it's hard because there is, as I was saying earlier, there's no best practices. There's no guideline of this is what you should do versus this is what you shouldn't have done. And I think even with the audits, like you said, people could gamify the system. People could fake their audits, etc. Be in cahoots with the people who are doing the audits. So it's also not a perfect system, but I think it's better than what we have right now. Right now, there is no oversight at all. There's no incentive. The penalties are not as high. And, you know, from an underground level, we're hearing that, you know, many companies don't have any sort of policy. And it's the system administrator, like one person in the company, or maybe one or two people in the company that are coming up with the policies for security for that entire company. And if that's what is between a breach of this size and not a breach of this size, that's not enough, right? So there needs to be some buy-in from the private sector top level where they will actually invest resources in this and make sure that it's actually working, because otherwise they could be penalized heavily. And you can see it working in the banks. They know that fraud is going to cost them money, so they have to have good practices for detecting fraud and avoid that.
In fact, the banks are a good example. The FFIEC, which is the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, they are the regulatory examiners of banks. They have a manual that the examiners use that has a section on data security. So when banks are audited by the government, there is a data security audit that's part of it, and it has various standards that are set out. I mean, what I would see the audit looking like, what you see in the financial world, you have GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Well, there would be the equivalent, generally accepted security principles that
Yes.
would. I can't wait to hear the comments on this one. That auditors would use in examining an organization. And it's probably not going to be like GAAP in the sense that the kind of security principles for a bank and what one would expect for a bank is probably going to be different than what one would expect for a toy store. But I think that's where we have to start. We have to start by articulating and say, look, these are the standards we're going to hold them to. And, you know, we see the first articulation of it. I mean, you look at the NIST handbook. NIST at least has a process. It doesn't give us substantive guidelines, but at least it sets out a process that institutions should be following. So at a minimum, tomorrow, we could audit to NIST. We could say, are organizations running through this NIST methodology to figure out what they need to do?
I think in banks, for example, we handle large amount of data in our model. So there are very clearly defined policies of what we can access, what we cannot access. So private information about clients, social security numbers and all, if we have to, let us say, move between systems and all, they are very well protected. There's like, this is the standard practice in every financial institution. Again, it is determined by the regulation and the information technology audit practices. And there is a special office which keeps track of it, that who's accessing the information and who's not. So these are like very standard. These are not even best practice. These are the standard practices.
I think also auditing makes it harder to argue that you had a lack of awareness about these issues. And it also makes you more aware of what reasonable security practices might be, right? Even if it's not defining what those are, the act of getting audited or having to produce some report helps you become more aware of what you're doing in your company and how to improve.
Last question from Nick.
So this gap idea, it sounds kind of familiar. I mean, I don't work in this area either, but working a little bit in securing IoT, and we've seen a lot of discussions of that nature there, like, oh, maybe we should have some standards and best security practices, and we can outline that and standardize it and somehow hold people to account. So the bank analogy made me think of a couple things. Well, I think part of this is maybe a question for you, Joel, and the rest of the panel. Maybe the bank scenario is more tractable because of the presence of a regulator and sort of organization of that industry. So I'm curious about thoughts on that. But on the flip side, aren't the new credit bureaus not going to be like Equifax and TransUnion and these folks, but actually like Amazon and Google and Facebook? In other words, I don't need to, you can regulate the heck out of Equifax but actually it might be some random, it might not be Facebook, it might be some other random cloud service that has poor security practices, that has a bunch of data that's going to be thrown into an algorithm that decides whether or not I get the loan. So
Then there would be, I mean, there's an interesting question
you
whether
assume-
Facebook is a credit reporting agency.
to put a
Whether they are already.
Possible.
Yeah, so to put a finer point
but-
on that, you know, you could regulate Equifax and credit reporting agencies, but is that looking under the lamppost?
Well, but it's regulating the activity, so it's,
Yeah.
if the I mean, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, it's I call it a permissible use statute. It says if you're collecting information that's gonna be used for the 7 statutorily enumerated purposes, then you're covered, which is why so there was a major, Fair Credit Reporting case, Robbins versus Spokio, that was before the Supreme Court, 2 years ago. It never reached the Fair Credit Reporting claim. Robbins claimed that Spokio was a credit reporting agency. It got kicked out on a procedural issue. But it gets to this point that the statute's regulating what the function is, not so much as and you become a regulated entity by performing that function, no matter what it is. On the gap side, I mean, it's a financial services example, but it's not from a regulated sphere of the financial services example, and that's the EMV chip. The chip and pin that Sanjay was referring to. That was a completely private arrangement between card issuers, merchants, and the card networks. Had no overlay of regulator activity that came up with that standard. And the EMV chip has a whole very detailed series of technical standards for security that participants in the system have to abide by.
Yeah, the payment card industry is a very good example of the private sector policing itself. So the PCI DSS is the data security standard that the payment card industry implements, and it's really managed by the major credit card companies, and they really force compliance upon retailers who want to process their credit card transactions, right? And there are audits that go in with that, and there are post-breach PFI reports that are required and are great from a regulator's perspective, because then we can just ask for that report, which tells us what caused the breach and what state their system was in, you know, prior to, and what their prior reports said, and if they were taking them seriously, if they were patching known vulnerabilities that were revealed in prior audits. So there are models out there that exist.
All right. I'm afraid we're out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And we'll invite you back next time we have a tech policy event that we think merits another panel. Please stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.